Good afternoon, everyone. This is Drew Camp, Director of Government Relations at the Ames Chamber of Commerce, and I'm coming to you for the close of the ninth week of this year's legislative session for our weekly legislative update. Today, I want to cover just a few things. They include the revenue estimating conference numbers that were released just this afternoon, the tax reform proposals that are currently being moved through the Senate and the House down in the legislature, the high-quality jobs reform proposal that's currently being discussed in the House, a House bill regarding how boards of supervisors are formulated in district as far as elections go. Right now we have just popular vote for the top 3 vote getters in Story County, but this bill would kind of make it where you have to elect them by district rather than the current system that we have in place. The SAVE extension for school infrastructure to 2050, and then the school equity and school supplemental state aid or education funding bill that was signed into law by the governor here this week. So I'll jump right into the revenue estimating conference that was just released this afternoon. And for FY 2018, the one we're currently in, which is very impactful because it impacts the de-appropriations bills that we're going to be looking at, there was an increase of $33.3 million in revenue. It's important to note that 28.4 million of that came as a result of the Job Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is somewhat difficult because they have mentioned down at the legislature that they do want to use that money to return to the taxpayers in tax reform. So we will see how they do that and how the increase of about $33 million impacts the de-appropriations bill, the level of de-appropriations that they plan to do in both the House and the Senate and ultimately pass and send to the governor. Those are hugely impactful to us because they impact both economic development and higher education, so we will very closely watch those numbers. For FY 2019, the Revenue Estimating Conference showed an increase of $206.8 million, but $188.3 million of that was a result of a combination of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. Finally, for FY 2020, the projection did decrease a little bit from 4.1% increase in revenue to 3.9% increase in revenue. Moving into the tax discussion, not much happened this week on the tax front. The governor's individual income tax reform proposal is moving through the House right now, but it hasn't had any action since last week when it passed out of a Ways and Means subcommittee. It's not expected to move forward or have anything happen with it until after the legislative funnel, the second funnel, which is next Friday, March 16th. So we expect to see some more things happening with that bill over the next couple weeks, but we will continue to work with legislators in the House on that bill, especially trying to get corporate included in some way. The Senate tax bill was passed a week and a half ago on a party line vote of 29 to 21. The House received it with somewhat of a cold shoulder, and they do plan on moving their own bill and taking their own path on tax reform, as previously mentioned, as they're moving the governor's bill. But we do, as I mentioned, continue to push for some of the inclusions of the Senate tax bill and the House tax bill or the governor's tax bill, mainly including corporate income tax reform as well. But the most important thing too to monitor is really make sure that as we do this, we're also showing fiscal responsibility and constraint as well to make sure that there's a good balance there as we work through that process. The next piece of legislation that I want to talk about was a bill that received attention in a House Ways and Means subcommittee on Monday. It passed out of the subcommittee, and it now it now awaits debate by the full committee for the remainder of session. It will be alive regardless of the legislative funnel because it's a Ways and Means bill. What the bill proposes is that 50% of allocations to the High Quality Jobs program, which is our premier economic development assistance program through the Economic Development Authority, would have to go to rural communities outside of the 11 most populous counties in the state. And as you can imagine, Ames and Story County fall into the 11 most populous counties, so it would adversely affect us, and it would especially adversely affect the 14 rural communities outside of Ames and Story County. So we have some real concerns about that bill and the contents of it and moving towards that direction. Current awards aren't necessarily something that need to be changed, we view. mostly because of the fact that they're based on merit and eligibility and not where you're located. So we think this is kind of an unnecessary piece. But if a discussion does need to happen about rural development, it needs to happen as part of the Lieutenant Governor's rural economic development and broadband discussion that was brought up in the governor's state of the condition of the state earlier this year. So we'll continue to talk with the Lieutenant Governor and his staff on maybe some things we can do to help with rural development outside of this bill. Another bill that we're monitoring that came up this week is a House bill that would require counties with a population of 60,000 plus to elect their supervisors by district. It passed the House 58 to 38 on Wednesday and awaits an assignment to the Senate Local Government Committee. It would impact Story County, and it would really ultimately remove local control, which is hugely important to individuals like the Board of Supervisors, local school boards, and city councils and mayors. And that's something that they're very attentive of, and they've already voiced concern for, because it's important that with bills like this that would impede local control, that we note that that would ultimately not let the constituents being impacted within the local jurisdiction, that being Story County, ultimately make that decision. So we will continue to watch that bill and monitor it and the impacts that it could have as we work with our partners over at the Story County Board of Supervisors. The SAVE extension to 2050 continues to move forward in the legislature. It passed a Senate subcommittee on Monday, and then it passed a House subcommittee on Thursday. It will remain alive for the remainder of the session as a Ways and Means bill, and we're optimistic that it should move forward and hopefully pass this session. It would have a huge impact on school districts throughout the state, but especially here in Ames and in Gilbert community school districts, who both have bond referendums going on the ballot on April 3rd and have huge infrastructure expenses as a result, that bill or that SAVE extension would ultimately very much help. Finally, the school equity and supplemental state aid bill were both signed into law this week by the governor. The school equity bill was signed into law on Thursday in Davenport, and the supplemental state aid bill, which was 1% or $32 million for education funding, was signed on Wednesday in Des Moines. So that's very important to get that bill signed prior to the March 15th certification of budgets for school districts, which it obviously did. And then the school equity bill is also very important because it helps with transportation cost, enrollment disparities, and also cost per pupil disparities. So it helps many school districts throughout the state as they try to balance some of the challenges that they're currently facing. As we look into next week, March 16th will bring the second legislative funnel, at which point Senate bills have to pass out of House committees and House bills have to pass out of Senate committees to remain alive, unless they're leadership bills, Ways and Means bills, and some other certain exemptions that are built in there. But we will be watching a lot of bills next week to see if they ultimately live or die once the March 16th second funnel comes to fruition. And we know that with that in mind, as we look towards the end of next week, it will be a very lively 10th week of the session. So please make sure you come back and join us next week for what will surely be a very full update. Thank you and have a nice weekend.